That we live in a world that is more interdependent than ever before is obvious. We're all aware of this. But what is not as clear is how nations, the United States and others, manage that interdependence to serve their and the global interest. The pace of change, in many respects, has outstripped the capability of governments or societies to cope with or adjust to all its implications. Well, thank you very much, Everett, and I really also want to thank all of you for coming out on a rainy day. Thank you for that very kind introduction. This is my most recent, but not my first opportunity to speak before this group in this very auditorium, and the kind of work you do, Noel, and your colleagues is just terrific in terms of bringing people together and identifying key issues on the national agenda and having a good dialogue on them. Let me just make a few broad comments about where I think we stand today in dealing with global economic issues. And it strikes me that if you go back to the period of the late 1940s and early 1950s, Americans really had a choice. Did they want to embrace global economic leadership, or did they want to retreat into a more insular position and avoid coming to grips with the problems of Europe, the rebuilding of Europe? And they chose to become more engaged, and the rest is history. It was very much in the American national interest to do that. At the same time, they also understood the need to make America more competitive. And during the 1950s in particular, there was an enormous amount of investment in the United States in terms of education, particularly after Sputnik in 1957, and the Eisenhower interstate highway system throughout the latter part of that period. And there was also a lot of corporate investment, rebuilding America to be more competitive in the post-World War II period. And I think Americans today face a similar kind of choice. We in this generation can look at the world and look at ourselves in two ways. One, we can fail to invest in a stronger and more competitive economy at home. We can shy away from making the tough choices required to put our nation on a sound financial footing and to promote greater reliance on clean domestic energy. And we can fail to seize on opportunities for increased trade and investment presented by the changing global economic geography. That's one alternative. The other is to make the necessary investments in education, in clean energy, improved infrastructure, and innovative research necessary to be more robust competitors in this expanding and increasingly competitive global economy. We can take the measures needed to ensure that our governments and our households bring spending and savings back into better balance to put our country and our overall economy on a sustainable financial track. And we can work with other nations, particularly the emerging powers, to promote a prosperous and stable global economic order that tackles the fundamental challenges that the world economy is going to face in coming years and decades. The latter set of choices will strengthen America's capacity to shape the world's economic future in ways that serve both our national and our global interest. But the former set of choices, that is to say, failure to make the necessary internal investments, failure to deal with our fiscal problem, failure to deal with their education problem and our energy problem, and withdrawing from global responsibility, or at least not fully engaging, will significantly diminish America's capacity to shape the future of the global economy and will seriously weaken this nation's and the world's economic prospects. That we live in a world that is more interdependent than ever before is obvious. We're all aware of this. But what is not as clear is how nations, the United States and others, manage that interdependence to serve their and the global interest. The pace of change, in many respects, has outstripped the capability of governments or societies to cope with or adjust to all its implications. There's a great quote by the former president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, who said, "Things have moved so rapidly, we have not yet had time to be astonished." And when you think about it, it is true. And I'll describe a few of these changes in a moment, because things have moved very rapidly in this period, particularly the last 10 years. And what is troubling to many Americans is that vast impersonal forces of great change, have had a profound impact on their lives and on their communities. They're asking if their government has the policies or the tools to cope with that change, and similar questions are being asked in other countries as well. It's useful, I think, briefly to review the magnitude and the nature of the changes we have experienced and see what kinds of changes have occurred in only the most recent 25 or 30 years. I look at it in a very simple way. When I first came into government, that was quite a number of years ago, in 1969, total trade was just over 10% of GDP. Today, it is 25% of GDP. That is enormous in a multi-trillion-dollar economy. That is a huge change. At that time, foreign investment in the United States was less than 1% of private fixed investment. Recently, it has averaged over 11%. And the numbers here, again, are quite spectacular when you look at just how much foreign investment there is in our country from the rest of the world. At that time, foreign governments, foreign businesses were really not big investors in the United States. Now they're enormous investors. What's particularly striking is the breathtaking rise in the importance of emerging economies. And I think that is the greatest change we've seen in this period of time. And when historians look back 100 years from now, they're likely to see this change, this rise of the emerging economies, as the defining event of our era. Just as World War II was the defining event of our parents' or our grandparents' era, I think the defining event of our era is going to be the rise of these emerging economies, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, and a number of others. And this poses an enormous challenge to the United States as the long-standing leader of the global economy. Much of the focus in the press has been on how these countries compete with the United States, but the fact that these countries are increasing in their economic strength and vitality also creates enormous opportunities. And if we do the right things at home, I think that the United States can compete with these countries and continue to thrive. The question is frequently asked, who is going to be the number one economy 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the road? And I would submit the following, and that is that whether the United States remains the number one economy, the leading economy in the world 20 years from now, say, depends a lot more on the choices we make at home than anything that happens in any other country in the world. And what does that mean? In order to continue to be the leader, the United States has to do a number of fundamental things in our own system. One, we have to strengthen the capacity of our workers in this country to compete with workers around the world. Two, we have to reform our schools and invest substantially more in the right kind of education, not just education, but in the kinds of reforms that are going on in New York and Washington, D.C., and Chicago and elsewhere. Three, we have to invest more in infrastructure. Anyone who goes to China and now even India and Brazil and many other parts of the developing world sees a huge amount of investment in infrastructure. We've got to modernize our infrastructure as well. Research and development require continued innovation, continued efforts. Clean domestic energy is critical. If we don't do that, we're going to lose jobs to other countries which are doing a lot more in this area, and we're going to continue to have a very high energy bill, and we'll continue to experience issues of climate change which are going to get worse and worse. All of these are critical to our ability to ensure that America's living standards and our job opportunities grow for years to come, and to ensure that we compete not only with the emerging powers, but also with traditional allies who are also investing in energy and infrastructure and education and doing a number of things. If you look at the school systems around the world and how students rate in terms of their success in various scores, the big successes are places like Scandinavia, Israel, Eastern Europe. So we're competing not just with the emerging economies, we're competing with a lot of very high quality developed economies, and therefore competition's coming from all angles. In the United States, if we don't rise to that competition, we're going to find that whatever happens around the world, we will begin to drift back relative to other countries. I think it's also important, however, to give our citizens greater opportunities to prosper in overseas markets, to take advantage of changes in other countries and in the global economy. One particular example is the Korean-US Free Trade Agreement, known as KORUS. This is a free trade agreement with one of the most important emerging economies in the world. And this kind of agreement is critical to further opening foreign markets at a time when most other nations are actively conducting free trade agreements of their own. President Obama made a very interesting point in his in his inaugural address, when he observed that sitting on the sidelines while others engage in such practices will cost us jobs at home. And I think that is a very fundamental point. A proactive trade policy with the right kinds of trade agreements can boost American jobs and living standards, whereas if we sit back and do nothing, the Europeans, the Chinese, and many other countries are very actively engaged in making free trade agreements of their own. And every time they do this, they shave a little bit more of the market share off of American companies and cost us, over a period of time, jobs in this country. The other point that is particularly important when we look at the fundamentals of the United States is that we have to bring our deficits under control. That is critical to our national strength. But as we do this, we're also likely to see pressures for cuts in defense expenditures, pressures for cuts in overseas investment and in foreign assistance as well. And as a result of that, we're going to have smarter diplomacy, because if we're going to accomplish what we want to accomplish internationally, and we're under constraints with respect to military spending, and we're under constraints with respect to foreign assistance, we're going to need new partners. We're going to need new partners to work with us on a variety of things. If you look around the world today, we are not going to be able to reach multilateral trade agreements, agreements on the environment, agreements on international financial reform, and many other things without the support of a large number of countries. So that while we have a multipolar world, we also have to have a multi-partner world. And this is a requirement if we're going to achieve our goals, and it means engaging not only with the traditional allies of the United States, Europe, Canada, Japan, and other countries, but it also means we need to develop common aims, common pursuits, congruent policies with countries in the emerging world. Also, I think that we need to look at the world, the term has been frequently used, global commons, but however one looks at it, we're more interconnected than ever before. And those connections around the world, connections by sea, by air, by satellite transmissions, and by the internet, have made the world economy much more efficient, but they've also made it a lot more vulnerable. And if we're going to preserve the openness and the stability of these global interconnections, we're going to have to do it with the support of the Chinas and the Indias and the Brazils and the Russias and the Saudi Arabias and the South Africas and a lot of other countries as well. And of course, I mentioned you need, in order to make the financial system less vulnerable to the kind of instability we've seen, we have to use the partnerships we've got using the Group of 20 and the Financial Stability Board and others to address these issues. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, the United States has a history of doing this, and I won't go into the the Marshall Plan and the OECD and the GATT and the WTO and the World Bank and the IMF. I think we're all aware of the fact that these institutions were critical after World War II in doing two things. One, they were needed in order to strengthen our alliances and bolster countries that had either been defeated in World War II and the United States wanted to rebuild, or our allies that had suffered ruin during the war and had lost a lot of their GDPs and a lot of their infrastructure. We understood that we needed to help these countries to rebuild and build a global order that would create a greater degree of global prosperity, not just for national security reasons, although that was the prime aim at the time, but it was also critical to our own economic future, because think what the American economy would have been like and what it would be like today if we did not see the recovery of Western Europe or the recovery of Japan or a number of other countries. What kind of export markets would we have had? What kind of security burdens would we have had with countries that didn't have the resources to provide money to support the NATO alliance or alliance with Japan? So this effort to reach out and establish a post-World War II economic order was critical from our prosperity point of perspective and from the point of view of our national security perspective. And now we have to look at the new changes that we're seeing in the early part of the 20th century and figure out how to develop a global order to address those. And I'll just touch on, pardon me, a few of them very quickly, just so we can go through them and see how much change there has been. I identified a few quantitative changes. Now let me just give you a little bit more detail on some of the fundamental elements of what we've seen. One of them, as I mentioned, is the new economic geography of these emerging economies. And I think it's useful to make a couple of points about them. First of all, while we see them as very big, powerful competitors, they don't necessarily see themselves in that perspective. Many of these countries, while they're big economies and they're very competitive, have relatively low GDPs per capita. Let me just give you an example. China has a population of 1.3 billion people, but its per capita GDP is only about 1/7 that of the United States. China represents, in terms of the world order, in terms of GDP per capita, is 92nd. Brazil is 72. India is 121. So these countries, while they're big economies, also see themselves internally as developing countries. And as a consequence, many of these countries have a domestic agenda which is very different from the domestic agendas of the G7 countries that really were the global steering group for the period from 1975 to the middle part of this decade. So their agenda is not the same as ours. Certainly their domestic agenda is not. But because they have such an important role in the global economy, it's also imperative that they assume a higher degree of responsibility for its openness, its stability, and its resilience, for the rules that, for instance, protect intellectual property and the rights of investors and the free flow of information. And if they do not assume, given their importance in the global system, don't assume these levels of responsibility, then the global system is not going to be as effective as it has been in the past. And the point we have to make to these countries is that they have an interest in doing this too. Now, we know over the period of decades that we have an interest in making sure the global economy works effectively because we depend so heavily on it. Many of these countries depend heavily on it, but they have not, over a period of time, developed that sense of stewardship that I think they will have to, and we will have to encourage them to, if the system is to work well. But I think there are 2 points worth mentioning in this process. One, we can't dictate to these countries. They have their own agendas. They're feeling, in many cases, very muscular about the role they want to play in the global economy, and they want to drive the debate. They're not going to simply take something that comes out of Washington and buy it. They have their own views, and therefore we're going to have to develop a kind of diplomacy which works with them to explain in very clear terms and in a very patient way the benefits they have, and also listen to them about the kind of changes they want in the global system to the extent they want them, and try to figure out ways of resolving any differences between the traditional economies and the emerging economies in various parts of the world, particularly Asia. A related point is that we should not, and they should not, look at this as a zero-sum game. If we look at it that way, that we win, they lose, or they win, we lose, then tensions and conflicts are inherent. So one way or another, the United States is going to have to work with them and try to get them to assume a greater set of responsibilities for the global system, not in a condescending way, not in an instructive way, and as a teacher tells a student, but more in terms of trying to find ways in which they see their interests being served by the proper functioning of the global system, and they in turn contribute substantially to the proper functioning of the global system. This doesn't mean that it's all dialogue and it's all going to be easy. The United States has strong interests, and we have to assert those very firmly where our interests are violated, and utilize the rules of the WTO and other institutions to address problems where we see our interests being violated by other countries, China or anyone else. But our main goal over a period of time is not to do that if we don't have to, but to try to find ways that are less divisive in the way we try to build the system of the 21st century. A second point that's well worth bearing in mind is that financial flows are very different today from what they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And that is very simple. Two things. One, if you look at the way finance moved for the period after World War II and for decades and decades prior to that, it was from industrialized to developing countries. That was the way money moved. But we look at the world today, and the United States is a large borrower from the rest of the world, and the big lenders are the big surplus countries. China's one, a number of East Asian countries, and the countries of the Middle East. So we're borrowing from emerging economies that have, as I pointed out, relatively low GDPs. This is a very substantial change in international financial history. These countries also have very substantial reserves. The industrialized countries' reserves are about $2 trillion. The emerging economy reserves are $6 trillion. Now, a big portion of that is China, but it's not only China. Russia has reserves, South Korea, Brazil, a number of these other countries. So they have a lot of reserves. The other is that they're a lot less leveraged than we are. The average leverage of an industrialized economy today is about 90%. That is to say, debt is about 90% of GDP. In most emerging economies, if you take the average, it's about 45%. So they don't have the deleveraging process to look forward to that we do. And that deleveraging over a period of time is going to mean we will have fewer resources for other things and probably slower growth. And it's quite clear that if you have to deleverage, if you have to cut government spending and government borrowing, it is likely, not in every case, but likely to keep growth relatively low, whereas if you don't have to deleverage, and most of these countries don't, it will tend to mean that their growth will be somewhat higher. A third basic point is that we're in the aftermath of a very substantial global recession, the worst since the Great Depression. And that has generated a lot of skepticism in some quarters of the United States about the benefits of globalization, of open trade, of the advantages of future trade liberalization, and some types of foreign investment. But there's another issue that may be more difficult to grasp, but I think it's also just important, and that is that one of the national security challenges the United States is going to face today is to demonstrate to ourselves and to the rest of the world that our system and our economy is capable of returning to its previous levels of growth and resilience. I'm convinced that we can do this, but there are many doubters, and particularly many doubters abroad. We in particular need to demonstrate that our political system is able to come together, to unify, to take the tough decisions required to put our national finances on a solid footing, to produce a robust economic policy, to produce a very robust and very successful energy policy, to revitalize our infrastructure, and pursue a proactive trade policy. If we fail to do this because of partisan divisions or lack of sufficient domestic support, we will not only hurt the U.S. economy, we will also undermine our global capacity to provide leadership. And this will enable other nations to tout the relative attractiveness of their economic systems, which would considerably enhance their soft power and their economic influence. Another point that I alluded to, but I'll talk a little bit more about, are these global interconnections, particularly the 21st century issue of the internet. As our daily lives become more dependent on computers, the internet, electronic transmissions of funds, smart grids, etc., the threat to them also grows. Global connectivity makes us all more efficient, but all more vulnerable as well. And cyber terrorism, cyber piracy, assaults on personal data, tapping into national security information are all dangerous 21st century threats to our economies, to our privacy, to our technological leadership, and to our national security. A series of consultations, new patterns of cooperation, use of old and new institutions is going to be likely to address these issues. Another big challenge is that there are new areas of competition. We're used to intense competition for markets, but now we also have competition for capital, competition for sources of energy, competition for key commodities, rare earths, lithium, and other things that are vital to the new economy of the 21st century. And there's likely to be more and more competition for things like arable land and water. I was recently in India, where there's an enormous amount of competition between India and Pakistan with respect to the Indus River. You're seeing the same kind of competition in the Nile River Delta among countries along the Nile. And the same thing with the Mekong. Water competition is going to be an increasingly difficult issue to deal with. And new rules and practices are going to be required to avoid, again, the zero-sum competition in these and other areas. Consistent with this same set of principles, we also need to avoid circumstances in which countries engage in systematic efforts inconsistent with global rules and norms to enhance prospects for their domestic economies or their national champion companies at the expense of others. Such practices, for instance, of piracy of intellectual property or forced transfers of such property to their companies from foreign companies to enhance their competitiveness around the world would be very harmful to the United States and would cause enormous tensions between the United States and countries that are engaging in this kind of process. This is a big issue with respect to China's indigenous innovation policy, but it's an issue with other countries as well. And then there's a very interesting issue of the role of government in economies. Bill Clinton, when he was president, made the point that the era of big government is over. Well, the era of big government has come back quite dramatically. Governments, government-owned companies, government-controlled companies, sovereign wealth funds are now assuming greater economic influence as providers of capital, as foreign investors, as domestic investors, as facilitators of national control over important technologies, as owners of overseas natural resources in what some call state capitalism. The full implications of all this are yet to be fully understood. In some cases, fears have been exaggerated, like, for instance, with respect to some of the sovereign wealth funds. But the risk of major misunderstandings, tensions, unlevel playing fields, trade distortions, all call for a new set of understandings and dialogues, and perhaps new rules and agreed practices to address these kinds of changes. Now, there are a variety of measures of addressing this, and I won't go into all of them, but simply let me make a few broad points about what we're doing now to deal with these changes. One, the Group of 20. The Group of 20 is engaging these emerging economies and our traditional allies to deal with a new set of issues, both financial, in terms of issues that arose during the financial crisis, the rebalancing of the global economic system, so that these large imbalances that we saw in the last couple of years will be narrowed over a period of time. Increasingly, the G20 is going to be dealing with development and other issues that will come up in the summit that's going to be held in Seoul in November, dealing with economic development, dealing with energy, dealing with anti-corruption, and a whole range of other things. We're also working very closely with Europe and Japan, and I think there's a tendency as we address the emerging economies, because they're such a compelling force in the global system, to neglect the fact that we still have a lot more trade and a lot more investment with Europe and with Japan and with Canada and with Mexico than we do with some of these large emerging economies. They're growing more rapidly, and trade and investment is growing more rapidly, but still, for most American companies, there's a lot more investment in Western Europe than there is in China. There's a lot more trade with Japan than there is with China. There's a lot more trade in general with Canada and Mexico than with India or Brazil or some of these other emerging economies. So we still need to recognize that these are important players in the way we deal with our global economic system and in efforts to reform that system. I think that one of the particularly important points about where we're going is that we not only have to deal with these other countries, we have to do so in a way that retains the credibility of the average American with respect to the policies that we pursue. And I think this is a point that too often gets neglected in Washington, and that is that for the U.S. government, if we do not have the support of the American people, if Americans do not see the global economy as benefiting them, if they do not see their government as taking positions that are firmly in the interest of the American worker and of the American company, then we're going to lose support for our international economic policy and our capacity to negotiate new trade agreements and our capacity also to run a vibrant, robust foreign policy. So while we engage internationally, and we're going to continue to do that, we also have to engage very directly with the American people to do two things. One, to convince them that we are, in fact, not just by words, but by deeds, we are defending their interests, but also to convince them, as had to be done in the 1950s, convince them that by engaging with the rest of the world, we're serving their interests. And this is critically important because, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of doubt about this. So we have to demonstrate that opening foreign markets, attracting foreign investment, protecting intellectual property, working with other governments to deal with a broad set of financial issues, these are all parts of a national jobs agenda in this country. Because if you look at the world where 95% of the world's consumers live abroad, where the bulk of the growth over the next 5, 6, 7 years is going to be not in the industrialized countries, but in the emerging economies, it's hard to have a jobs agenda in this country that's successful without taking advantage of opportunities in the global market. Now, clearly, we have to do what we have to do at home. We can't expect to work our way out of our difficulties by exporting our way out of those difficulties. We have to make the necessary investments at home that I mentioned before and that of the kind we did in the 1940s and 1950s. There is no substitute for that. Whatever we do internationally will not succeed if we do not invest in education, if we do not have a stronger educational system, if we do not get the best and the brightest from the rest of the world wanting to come here for education, for research, to start companies, if we do not deal with our energy issue. These are all kinds of problems that need to be addressed at home. But you also need an international dimension to this policy, and that's where further opening markets through the Korean-U.S. trade agreement, through the Trans-Pacific trade agreement, the TPP, that's being negotiated with a number of countries in the region. This is where market opening comes in and where attracting foreign investment comes in. And I think, therefore, that in conclusion, the fundamental point that I would like to leave you with is we've got a major international agenda to do all the things that I've described and to cope with the new challenges that I've described, but we also have a formidable task at home to demonstrate to the American people that our way of doing business, that our government is able to achieve the kind of results that will enhance job prospects and enhance prosperity. And this is going to be a big challenge for this administration and for our government. We have to come together as a country and address these issues. If we fail to do that, we will fail to put in place the kinds of fundamental changes that are required for growth in jobs and growth in economic opportunity for Americans for years to come. We will also be far less competitive in the face of intensified foreign competition from abroad. And we will, thirdly, demonstrate to the world a negative about the United States, that we can't pull ourselves together. And if we can't pull ourselves together internally to deal with our economic issues, our ability to compete with other countries, not just economically, but on foreign policy and other issues, is going to be badly diminished. And therefore, we have these challenges. They're very serious challenges. We have to make, as I mentioned at the outset, fundamental choices. Do we want to invest in the kind of things that are needed to strengthen our economy at home? And do we want to engage more actively with the world economy? Or are we going to remain so divided that we will fail to make the necessary investments at home and move toward a greater degree of insularity so that we don't engage with the world economy that's changing very rapidly? These are the choices that we have to make, and we will see whether over the next several years we can make the right choice. The people who govern this country, the Marshalls, the Atchisons, the Trumans, and the generation, what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, they made the right choices to rebuild at home and to engage abroad. And the question is whether this generation will do that or choose a route that weakens us internationally and weakens us at home. And we still have to make that choice. Thank you very much.